Speier is joining us now. I'm thrilled to have you, Congresswoman. I think that many in the country, I'm so glad that Chris is doing this, because I think that many in the country think we threw a sequestration and nobody came. In other words, we heard the hue and cry, but really has there been any impact? And we've just exhibited how there indeed will be a serious impact.
Well, indeed. In fact, my colleagues on the Republican side spent a couple of hearings that I was in on oversight and government reform saying, see, there's nothing wrong. And then 2 weeks later, we were passing the FAA sequestration fix. So, yes, they're real cuts. And, you know, losing the majority in the House has had real consequences. And it's important for Americans that think that, you know, our values should include providing services to victims of domestic violence. Many shelters will close now. Many people won't access domestic violence services because of these cuts. I mean, it goes to every single program in the federal government.
And the cuts, the sequestration cuts, are taking a toll on programs from sexual assault victims in the civilian world, too. Tim Murphy of Mother Jones Magazine reports on cuts to these programs across the country. In Louisiana, the sexual assault nurse examiners, a group of 11 nurses who make house calls to collect evidence from rape victims, considering closing for good. The Kentucky Domestic Violence Association cutting a sexual assault prevention coordinator and asking another to go part-time. If funding isn't restored by the next year, it may be forced to close shelters. Nia Malika, when the concerns were over the FAA and the travel delays, okay, all of a sudden there was some remedying of that. Do you see anything taking place when the subject is sexual assault?
Well, so far, no. You had yesterday a group of legislators went to the White House, talked to Valerie Jarrett, talked to Tina Chen about this problem of sexual assault, particularly in the military. I think the problem that the sequester has always had in terms of gaining a lot of traction with the American people is that it hasn't been widespread in terms of the impact that it has. And you see something like the FAA and flights being delayed. People can see that. You see the long lines of people and flights being delayed. But a lot of these other programs, whether it's sexual assault victims or people who get their meals delivered as part of Meals on Wheels, that's something that people don't necessarily see. So when it's taken away, there's not a real ruckus over it, and there's also not a real strong lobbying arm, right, on the Hill for victims of sexual assault. What you have here, a lot of praise that the Violence Against Women's Act was passed, right, by the House and the Senate, and then passed by the White House. But again, you're going to have $20 million in cuts. So you'll see a lot of these programs having to close their doors, and we'll have to see over these next weeks as they try to restore some of these cuts, whether or not these programs are included.
Congresswoman Speier, what is the likelihood that something is done about sequestration where the economy, and I'm thinking of housing, I'm thinking of the Dow at 15,000, I'm thinking of a number of indicators that the whole economy is finally getting back on track, and the debt and deficit are being impacted favorably, might make it even more difficult to undo some of the sequestration cuts?
I think it's going to make it more difficult. I mean, the revenues coming in April were higher than expected. The actual costs and the movement to which we would get to the debt limit seem to be slowing now. We will still get there, where we're going to have to raise the debt limit again. But it has had, there are some parts of it that have been very appropriate in terms of seeing the cost of government go down. But here's the problem. When you're a senior on Meals on Wheels, when you're a victim of domestic violence, you don't have a voice. And that's the problem. And for those of us that care deeply about those kinds of programs, people in need, we're going to have to really stand firm moving forward. No more fixes relative to sequestration unless we fix some of those programs that have people that just don't have the voice. They don't have a K Street
Congresswoman, I only have a minute left with both of you, but I said at the outset when I was chatting with Nia Malika that I think the perception across the country in some quarters is that there's been no impact, no negative. It's the Y2K of budget cuts, this whole business of sequestration. Take my final 30 seconds and tell me, what would you like to say to those people?
Well, I would say to those people, they are not living in the real world. These are programs that are needed. We have expectations that people aren't going to be on the street who are recently victims of domestic violence. 70,000 people, mostly women, won't be able to access shelters because of this sequestration. So it's really going to harm people.
Thank you both for being here. Happy Mother's Day as well. Thank you, Congresswoman Jackie Speier and Nia Malika Henderson.